Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So on Monday of this week, November 30th, the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season officially ended. And what a record-breaking season it was. There were 30 named storms that broke the previous record of 28. But is that proof that climate change is causing more frequent and more powerful storms? No. You've heard that it is, because every year we are told that the hurricanes are a result of climate change. It's a different superlative depending on what it is. It's either the most, like we had this year, or the earliest, or the latest, or the most major storms, or the most flooding, or the most damage based on dollars. There's always some superlative that the climate change alarmists tout as proof that climate change is making hurricane seasons worse. But these statistics don't support that. Just as a for instance, in 2020, as I said, we had 30 named storms. But the first 7 of those, Arthur, Bertha, Cristobal, Dolly, Edward, Faye, and Gonzalo, were tropical storms. As were 10 more of the 30. Josephine, Kyle, Omar, Renee, Vicky, Wilfred, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Theta. So 17 of the 30 named storms were tropical storms, not hurricanes. Although Alpha was technically a subtropical storm, but still, Alpha got named, Alpha counts. There were 30 named storms in the Atlantic hurricane season. So that's one metric that the climate change alarmists are touting. Oh, we had more named storms than ever before. Okay, that's true. I'll give them that. The 2020 Atlantic hurricane season had 6 major hurricanes: Laura, Teddy, Delta, Epsilon, Eta, and Iota. That tied the number in 2017, Harvey, Irma, Jose, Lee, Maria, and Ophelia, which also tied the number we had in 1996, Bertha, Edward, Fran, Hortense, Isidore, and Lily. But is that 3-way tie a record? No, it is not. 2005 had 7 major storms: Dennis, Emily, Katrina, Maria, Rita, Wilma, and Beta. 2005 was also the year that Dennis hit Pensacola and Katrina hit New Orleans. That was 15 years ago, and it had more major hurricanes than 2020 did. So what, did climate change go away for 14 years and then all of a sudden come back this year? No. These things fluctuate. There are busy seasons and there are light seasons. So really the only fair way to look at it, assuming you're not just wanting to scare people in pursuit of a political agenda, is to look at it as an average per decade, which is what I've done. So the 10-year period of 2011 through 2020, there were 31 major hurricanes. Easy math, divide that by 10, the average is 3.1 major hurricanes per season. Is that a lot? Well, the previous decade, of 2001 to 2010, had 37 major storms. Divide that by 10, it's 3.7. Which means that the most recent decade, which includes the 2020 hurricane season that just ended, had 16.2% fewer major storms than the decade of 2001 to 2010. But we're supposed to believe that hurricanes have grown bigger, stronger, more destructive, and more frequent because we drive SUVs and air condition our homes? Now, because there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, meaning you can manipulate statistics to indicate just about anything you want, depending on where your starting point is. But since I don't do that, I am pointing out that 2001 through 2010 was 14.8% higher than the previous decade of 1991 to 2000. Again, these things fluctuate. And when you look at the total number of major storms over the past 30 years, the average per year was 3.16. So yes, 6 is above average. But 11 to 20 years ago, the average for that decade was 3.7 per year. Because the number of major hurricanes varies. But the climate change liars say that humans have caused more frequent and more intense storms as we heat the planet. Yet the past decade has supposedly been the hottest decade ever recorded, and yet the average number of major hurricanes decreased 16.2% from the previous decade. How do the climate alarmists account for that? Well, they don't, because they don't have to, because they're never questioned on it. Have you heard that before? Probably not, because the climate change alarmists and their co-conspirators in the media censor anything that challenges their anthropogenic climate change fraud scheme. But I assure you, these numbers are accurate. Now, those numbers that I just gave you were major storms, category 3, 4, or 5. What about all hurricanes? 2020, we're told, had the most named storms of any hurricane season ever. And that's true. But only 13 of them were actually hurricanes. 17 of them, as I mentioned earlier in the program, were tropical storms. So is 13 a lot of hurricanes? Yeah, it's above average. In fact, it's almost double the average for the last 10 years. Because the average for the last 10 years was 7.3. But 2005 had 15 hurricanes. And when we look at the entire decade as the average, the decade of 2011 through 2020, the average number of hurricanes per year was 7.3. When we look at the previous decade of 2001 to 2010, the average number of hurricanes per year was 7.8, which means there were 6.4% fewer hurricanes in the decade of 2011 to 2020 than in the previous decade of 2001 to 2010. The 30-year average for hurricanes, 7.16 per year. So while 2020 was almost double the annual average, for the decade, it was almost 6.5% lower than the previous decade. So 2020 is an outlier. I'm not disputing the objective fact that there were more named storms in 2020 than any other year. What I'm disputing are all of these post-hurricane stories you're reading, and actually many of them you read even during the hurricane season, that attributed this terrible season we just came out of to climate change, despite there being no evidence to support that. It is irresponsible of the media to sensationalize weather as they do. 2020 had 13 hurricanes, of which 5 were Category 4 or 5, meaning 130 mile per hour winds or higher. Laura, Teddy, Delta, Eta, and Iota. 5's a lot, but it didn't break any record. It did tie the record, though. 2005 had 15 hurricanes, of which 5 were Categories 4 or 5. Dennis, Emily, Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. In 1999, there were 8 hurricanes, of which 5 were Category 4 or 5 storms. Brett, Cindy, Floyd, Gert, and Lenny. 5 out of 8? Gee, there's a superlative right there. 8 hurricanes may not be a huge number, but 5 of them were Category 4 or 5? Ooh, that means we're getting stronger. Right. 21 years ago. Shouldn't storms have been increasing in frequency and intensity pretty much every year since? Objective facts indicate that 2020 was an above-average hurricane season. But it was not the record-shattering season the alarmists are trying to convince you that it was. We got to take a break, but when we get back, I want to continue on this point. Understand that my goal here is not to convince you that 2020 hurricane season was nothing. It was a big deal. My goal here is to tell you the side of the story the media's not telling you. Because all you're hearing in the media is that 2020 was a record-breaking hurricane season, and it was all because of climate change. I'm simply pointing out that that claim is being driven more by a political agenda than it is by objective facts. Speaking of which, I'll give you some more objective facts when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So we're discussing the end of the 2020 hurricane season, which just ended this past Monday, November 30th. And you're seeing and hearing and reading a lot about how it was a record-shattering hurricane season brought about by climate change. How human activity is causing more carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, to be released into the atmosphere, which is causing more frequent, more intense, more destructive, more expensive storms, even though the evidence doesn't support that. 2 years ago, Hurricane Michael hit Panama City. Remember, those of us in Pensacola, we were in the pathway of that, and then it turned at kind of the last minute, and we ended up actually having a pretty nice day that day while our neighbors to the east were getting pummeled. Hurricane Michael was a Category 5 storm, but that doesn't mean that climate change caused it. It doesn't even mean that climate change made it worse. Hurricane Camille was much stronger than Michael, and Camille was in 1969. Did climate change cause Camille? Hurricane Wilma in 2005 was stronger. Did climate change cause Wilma? Hurricane Janet in 1955 was stronger. Did climate change cause Janet? Hurricane Allen in 1980 was stronger. Did climate change cause Allen? Hurricane Gilbert in 1988 was stronger. Hurricane Rita in 2005 was stronger. Hurricane Anita in 1997 was stronger. Hurricane Irma in 2017 was stronger. Hurricane Mitch in 1998 was stronger. Hurricane David in 1979 was stronger. Hurricane Carla in 1961 was stronger. And the Labor Day storm of 1935, before we started naming hurricanes, was also stronger. Did climate change cause that storm? There were dozens of other hurricanes that were also stronger than Hurricane Michael. Did climate change cause those? No. Some hurricanes are strong, and some hurricanes are not as strong. Their intensity is not caused by anthropogenic climate change, and neither is the frequency of these storms. Yet the liars in the climate change industry, which is what it is, are constantly telling us every single time there is a weather event that deviates from the norm, or at least what we perceive as the norm, we're told that it's a result of human activity causing climate change. And that's simply not supported by the evidence. Another example happened in 2017. When Hurricane Harvey dumped a record-breaking amount of rainfall over Houston. The climate change alarmists ran out and said, wetter storms, the result of climate change. But did Harvey dump more water than your typical major hurricane? The flooding in Texas from Hurricane Harvey was due to two primary factors: the topography of the region and the fact that the storm stalled over southeast Texas. All tropical storms and hurricanes deliver a significant amount of rainfall. But how did Harvey compare? Well, in 2004, Hurricane Ivan's wind and storm surge devastated the Florida Panhandle. Ivan dropped 16 inches on Pensacola in a 48-hour period. And as Ivan moved northward over the next few days, 5 inches of rainfall fell in a continuous path all the way to New Hampshire. Some areas received more than 7 inches. Now, a precise theoretical total is simply impossible to tabulate, but it's reasonable to state that Pensacola would have received more than 40 inches of rain had Ivan stayed over the Pensacola area like Harvey stayed over the Houston area. 40 inches is what Harvey dropped on Houston. But contrary to what we've been told, Hurricane Harvey was not caused by climate change, and neither was the associated flooding. But the fraudsters never miss an opportunity to exploit a natural disaster for political gain. That same year, 2017, Hurricane Irma came through Florida, and the fake news said that Irma's 185-mile-per-hour winds made her the most powerful Atlantic hurricane in history. But was she? No. And I knew it then. I looked it up then. If I could look it up, why couldn't the big media look it up? The data was very easy to find. Hurricane Irma had sustained winds of 185 miles per hour. That's pretty strong. I'm not denying that. But Hurricane Allen in 1980 had winds of 190 miles per hour. Why did the media tell us that Irma's 185 mile per hour winds made her the most powerful Atlantic hurricane in history when clearly Allen's winds were stronger? Why doesn't the media care about the truth? Do you remember in 2005? That was the very busy season. We had more hurricanes in 2005 than we had in 2020. Because remember, 17 of 2020's storms were tropical storms. We had 15 hurricanes in 2005. And do you remember what the climate change fraudsters warned would happen? They said the next decade would bring bigger, stronger, more frequent, more destructive storms. Run for your lives! Well, that didn't materialize. In fact, the subsequent decade was nearly a historic low in both the frequency and intensity of cyclonic activity in the Atlantic. You know how many storms there were in 2006? 5. 2007? 6. 2008? 8. 2009? 3. Ticked up a bit in 2010. We had 12 hurricanes. In 2011? 7. In 2012? 10 hurricanes. How many in 2013? 2. I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but you get the point. The number of hurricanes varies. Some years there's a lot, some years there's not a lot. But as predictable as the saliva in the mouths of Pavlov's dogs, the climate change fraudsters blame every hurricane season on man-made climate change. And the so-called news media is all too eager to lap it up and spoon-feed it to us. Before storms were named, the Category 5 hurricane that struck New England in 1938 had winds of 160 miles per hour. The Cuba storm of 1932 had winds of 175 miles per hour. And Cuba had been hit by a hurricane with 165 mile per hour winds just 8 years earlier in 1924. And what about the Great Labor Day storm of 1935 that battered Florida with 185 mile per hour winds? Climate change back then? Did man-made climate change cause or intensify the hurricane that destroyed Galveston in 1900? She was a Cat 4 storm with 8,000 fatalities. She remains the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. I could go on with so many other examples of massive and powerful storms that have occurred in recorded history. Were those caused or made worse by climate change? No, they were not. And neither were the storms of the 2020 hurricane season. And let's not forget that the first European settlement in what is now the United States was not St. Augustine in 1565. It was Pensacola in 1559. But Don Tristan de Luna's Pensacola settlement was destroyed. Destroyed by what? A hurricane. In 1559. The climate change alarmists, along with their allies in the so-called news media, want you to believe that hurricanes have gotten worse because we emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide constitutes 0.04% of atmospheric gases, not 4% and not 0.4%. 0.04%. That's 4/100ths of a percent. It's negligible. And human activity causes only 3.4% of that. So man-made carbon dioxide is only 0.00136% of the Earth's atmosphere. What constitutes the other 99.864%? Nitrogen at 78%, oxygen at 21%, and argon at 1%, plus some other trace gases like nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, ozone, helium, xenon, neon, etc. And those percentages do not include the water vapor in the atmosphere. But water vapor is by far the most abundant greenhouse gas, and it's the biggest cause of heat retention by the Earth's atmosphere, which is necessary to sustain life. But Mike, why should we believe you? 97% of scientists say humans are causing climate change. Do you know the genesis of that 97% claim? That 97% claim is repeated so often that people believe it to be true, but it doesn't hold up under scrutiny. It's based on a 2009 study conducted by the University of Illinois, and that so-called study asked questions in an online survey that was answered by 3,200 scientists. But only 160 of them were climate scientists. That's 5%. And only 79 of those climate scientists had published more than half their work in peer-reviewed papers. Well, 77 of those 79 climate change scientists agreed that global temperatures had generally risen since 1800 and that human activity was a significant contributing factor. And since 77 of 79 is 97.4%, that's the genesis of the 97% claim. Now, you may think peer-reviewed, these guys must be good. Well, you might think that, but it wouldn't necessarily be the case. Because that peer-reviewed criteria is part of the problem. Because climate scientists whose research counters the anthropogenic climate change theory are censored and not published. Now look, there is scientific evidence that supports the theory of anthropogenic climate change. I'm not saying there isn't. I'm just saying there's also scientific evidence that does not support the theory. But the climate change alarmists silence the researchers whose studies do not support the predetermined narrative of the alarmists. There's plenty of scientists who have conducted research that counters that consensus, but they can't get published in peer-reviewed journals. And they find it very difficult to get any funding, and they're ridiculed and mocked as climate change deniers. Are humans causing climate change? We don't know for sure. We need to research it, but it needs to be researched with an open mind. We can't just accept data that confirms our predetermined outcome. Contrary to what the dishonest alarmists claim, the theory of anthropogenic climate change is not settled science. The strategy of today's climate change alarmism is that having changed the term from global warming to climate change, everything can be blamed on human activity. It's winning propaganda no matter what happens. Is it hot? That's due to climate change. Is it cold? That's due to climate change. Is it raining? Climate change. Is it dry? Yep, climate change. Are there a lot of hurricanes? Well, that's due to climate change. Are there only a few hurricanes? That's due to climate change too. Forest fires, tornadoes, earthquakes, blizzards, droughts, floods, famine, locust, disease, war, crime, poverty, unhappiness. It's all due to climate change. Is the science of anthropogenic climate change real? Yes, it is. Unfortunately, it's based upon political science. And it's disgraceful. And since we're making political decisions based on it, it's also dangerous. All right, I've spent way more time on this subject than I meant to, but I had a lot to say. When we get back from this break, Florida hit a milestone this week that has nothing to do with hurricanes. But that also is being grossly misrepresented by the so-called news media. I'll tell you what they're saying, and more importantly, I'll tell you the truth that they're not telling you. When the Mike Bates Show continues.